conversation off to a roaring start.
Thank you, Jim. Jim should actually be up here, since one of my comments is the Presbyterians were woefully neglected in this, and I hope you'll join in the conversation. It is an honor to me to welcome this panel. Let me begin at my far left with Professor Dennis Dickerson. It's a particular pleasure to introduce him as the James M. Lawson Jr. Professor of History, and he is also my colleague in the Divinity School. So he brings many hats to this discussion. His teaching and research specialties include labor, the civil rights movement, African American and just general American religious history, as well as Wesleyan studies. He's a distinguished historian and author of several books, including one published just this year on the interaction of politics and religion. The title of the book is African American Preachers and Politics, The Careys of Chicago. Of a special significance to this panel is his extensive scholarship about and leadership in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, where he is an ordained minister, church historian, and representative at Interfaith Dialogues. You will see many of our panelists are both academicians and practitioners and leaders of religion here today. Sitting next to him is David Hudson, who is a scholar with the First Amendment Center and a graduate of Vanderbilt Law School, so we claim him in a couple of ways here today as well. He's published widely on the intersection of law and religion, and more especially on the U.S. Supreme Court, the Constitution, and students' rights. He teaches First Amendment classes at the Nashville School of Law, the Vanderbilt University Law School, and he teaches at Middle Tennessee State University as well. Next to David is SABINA MOHYUDDIN. She's a native Nashvilleian and a Vanderbilt graduate. As an active member of the Islamic Center of Nashville for the past 14 years, she has directed youth programs and women's programs at the center. She brings to the panel significant expertise in interfaith dialogues. And finally, Dr. Marty Bell teaches religious studies at Belmont University. In addition to a doctorate from Vanderbilt, he holds an M.Div from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, but tells me tonight that he also assists in leading worship in pastoring three Methodist congregations in the area. He, in addition, teaches history of Christianity. In addition to teaching history of Christianity, Professor Bell is a trained spiritual director with deep interest in contemplative spiritual disciplines and teaches world religions at Belmont. So you can see we have a variety of academic, professional expertise here and religious expertise, and I invite the panelists to draw on both as they respond to this film. The Dean foreshadows the question I have for you, which is, all such programs, in fact any class that attempts to teach American religious history, must have a beginning and an end, and is limited by various constraints, by the themes chosen to emphasize. And I wanted to invite each of the panelists, beginning, if I might, with Marty, asking him if he'll reflect on, and then going through the panel, reflecting on the question, if you had been the director of this particular segment of the larger program, what would you want to add to it? And if you feel so inclined to answer the Dean's question as well, where do you think there were some missed opportunities in this program? So, Marty, would you take up that question?
Sure, I'm glad to do that. First of all, I have the luxury, I'm teaching history of religion in America this semester, of having 45 hours, and there are only 6 hours. So overall, I'm fairly impressed with what was done. The Baptist and the Methodist, those are the traditions that I have participated in all my life, obviously get a lot of airtime, and a lot of things were said about revivalism. One of the things that I think was a little bit biased is the whole role of frontier. I think that is very important, but I think American revivalism was not simply a frontier phenomenon. So I think that was an issue that could have been addressed differently. And also, I think that period, basically from the Revolution leading up to the American Civil War, for me personally is the most interesting period, and there are lots of interesting movements that just didn't get discussed at all. And I would have liked to have seen what I think historian Winthrop Hudson called countervailing trends get a little bit more attention.
Sabina?
Well, one thing I would have liked to have seen is the inclusion of Islam in the beginning of American history, because they were coming here as slaves. It's estimated somewhere between 30 to 50% of the slaves were Muslims. So it was a religion that is already here and known among the Americans. And it was very interesting that Thomas Jefferson, after he passed that bill in the Virginia legislature for freedom of religion, he said that this is for Jews and Gentiles, for Christians, for Mohammedans, which was the name for Muslims, for Hindus and infidels. So he said that specifically. Now in today's environment, people don't see that connection that the founding fathers knew about Islam and expected that freedom of religion to extend to Muslims. And Thomas Jefferson, just by the way, that he had his own copy of the Quran, and that was the copy that Congressman Keith Ellison used to swear into the legislature.
Thank you. Thank you. David?
I enjoyed the program very much. I think I would have liked to seen more in the first 20 minutes, I think was devoted predominantly to the role of Thomas Jefferson. And I don't believe there was a single mention of James Madison. And James Madison is arguably the chief expositor and protector of religious liberty among the founding fathers. We think of, the film talked about Jefferson's statute that was eventually passed. It was Madison's work as a Virginia legislature that led to that passage. Also, I believe in 1785, Madison authored his famous memorial and remonstrance document, which some argue is the greatest piece written by a political leader with respect for the need for religious liberty. So for various reasons, I think there probably should have been mention of James Madison. The other thing, when it talked about revivalism and mass religious group meetings, one area, and maybe this could be in the third hour, but one of the areas I thought they could have explored a little bit more was the intersection between religion and the death penalty, in the sense that at a lot of executions, executions used to be public. There were long-winded religious sermons that accompanied those hour-long spectacles. And I thought that would be an interesting topic to explore. Would have been, usually when we talk about the death penalty, we have death penalty proponents quoting Leviticus and Exodus, and perhaps others quoting a few passages from the New Testament. But the impact of religion and the religious sermons that accompanied these public executions, I thought would have been an interesting topic to explore.
Thank you.
I agree with everything my colleagues have said. I would just simply add a couple of topics which I think are central to understanding the broad landscape of American religion. One, the theme of freedom was offered as a an uncomplicated concept, primarily in the civic arena. It did not have very much success, at least in certain quarters, as a theme when applied to interpretations of the Scripture. I would have liked to have seen that concept complexified when applied to the Bible. Many persons who tried to uphold establishment hegemonic practices, slavery, for example, there are others as well, found themselves singularly uninterested in freedom themes when preaching and when applying the Bible to those very knotty and inscrutable issues. And I would have liked to have heard something said, at least that biblical interpretation was complicated, and it was more than just pronouncing that one needed to be saved. A religion that was only really one actually very small component of religious practice during the period under discussion. That's number one. The second thing I wish there had been greater appreciation demonstrated was the way in which the boundaries of religion were far broader than was presented. I mean, there's a healthy tradition of a freer intellectual inquiry divorced from organizational structures. Here I'm talking about the Quakers, the deists. In the early 19th century, we have the founding of the Church of Latter-day Saints, Joseph Smith. There were a number of groups that were pushing the boundaries beyond the fairly narrow parameters that were presented in the narrative that we saw this evening. I wish there had been at least a nod, an acknowledgement that these persons, many of whom became very, very influential in shaping the civic culture, that there had been some acknowledgement of their presence and importance, if not just through a quick mention in the narrative.
I don't suggest now we follow Dr. Dickerson's lead here and return to each of those subjects and invite you to suggest how the narrative would have changed if they had included what you were talking about. Let's begin with David, if I may. If this piece had been written from the perspective of James Madison's values about the relationship between church and state and his efforts, how would the story have changed than what we see with Jefferson? And this really invites you to talk a little bit about what were their respective attitudes towards the relationship between church and state that might have been different, and also whether we're talking about cities, and if we had brought in Islam earlier, what would have been the contribution to the story of American religion itself? What themes would have allowed us to talk about? Dr. Dickerson mentions, for instance, this complexifying of the role of the Bible in both supporting slavery and supporting liberty at odds. So for Dr. Dickerson, if you would again bring up the end, what I want to ask you about is, it seems to me there's a darker side of religion that could have been raised in this that would have explained why there was a need for separation, not just to protect religion, but also to protect the state. But if you wouldn't kind of bring in the end again on this, but let's start with David, if you will, and talk about how would Madison have changed the story that we were given tonight?
Well, I think it would have expanded the story and focused more on the actual religious liberty clauses of the First Amendment. You know, the First Amendment was mentioned quite briefly in the narrative. I think it was mentioned once, maybe twice. And Madison had a role, of course, in culling together when he called together the various provisions and introduced them as the Great Rights of Mankind on June 8, 1789, I believe, when he introduced them before Congress. He looked at the various religious liberty provisions of different state constitutions and saw that religious liberty was found in many of those constitutions. But there would have been a discussion on the specific choice of verbiage for what Gene referred to as the first 16 words of the First Amendment, the religious liberty clauses, and the language changed. I think there would have been a fuller discussion with respect to, it made it seem like that that it was sort of Jefferson versus Henry, and really it was much more multifaceted than that. So it would have given a deeper historical perspective, and it may have been interesting too if it may not have been time, but their positions arguably changed over time. And so the Jefferson as a state legislature versus the Jefferson as a president, vis-a-vis Madison as a state legislature versus Madison as a president. And their positions were not arguably consistent. And it would have been nice to see what positions were done for matters of political expediency versus their perhaps true beliefs.
And if I may, I think you also would get a sense of the distinction between treating religions fairly and not treating them at all. Jefferson stands more for this idea of we separate from, we need no law respecting religion, and free debate handles all the problems, and as long as it doesn't pick my pocket or break my leg, I don't need to pay attention to religion. Where Madison is much more this sense of fairness. We do recognize religion in the public polity, but we must recognize it in a way that treats them identically, as opposed to not treating them at all. And that really plays out later. And it seems to me the script in this film ended on Madison's point, though it began on Jefferson's point, and didn't explain that contrast. It acted as if those were coherent ideologies for the separation of church and state.
It also didn't really explain the different historical interpretations of the wall of separation between church and state. That was a rather crabbed mention without fuller explication.
So you have Jefferson's wall and you have Madison's line. Madison would draw a line between them and Jefferson would erect a wall. But yes, it would have been a difference. So Marty, what would you have seen in terms of differences?
Well, if I can pick up on this conversation, I think for many viewers there may be some confusion as we start out with Jefferson and the Baptist and we end up with Hughes and the Irish Catholic immigration. One of the ways that I think this was oversimplified is there's not a real discussion about religious liberty at state and local levels. I mean, for instance, Massachusetts doesn't disestablish until 1833, and I think a lot of viewers may have this assumption, well, wasn't this taken care of? When in fact, it sort of worked its way down, and I might even say is continuing to work its way down. I was thinking in 1963 as a first grader in the state of Tennessee, we started with a reading from the King James Bible and the Lord's Prayer.
Probably
in my
someone
lifetime.
out there still is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Sabina, what would you have liked to have had carried on in the story? What values about America do you think would have come out if we had begun with Islam? What would be different today if we'd begun this story with Islam present as early as the late 17th,
I think
early
you
18th century?
take away that idea that it's an exotic religion and that it was part and parcel of the American society. And also, and it probably is in the next hour of the presentation, should have dealt with, especially with the slaves having such a large population of Muslims within the slave population, that how they were suppressed. They were forced to convert, or they weren't allowed to practice the religion until they forgot what it was. And so it will tie in, and I don't know what they show later on, but with the civil rights movement and then the Nation of Islam emerging, and then eventually many of the Nation of Islam followers becoming African American Muslim, coming into mainstream Islam. And so people don't know or don't realize that 1/3 of Muslims in America are African American Muslims, and they weren't thinking that they were converting to a new religion, but they were thinking they were going back to their ancestors.
So you would have had a history of Islam in America that would have been as traditional as any
Yes.
other religion we might look around today. It would have also diversified the story of the African American in America, period, right, Dennis?
Yes,
it would have
great
changed
deal. One of the things that I say to students that on the eve of the Civil War, or right after the Civil War, Christianity actually was a minority religion among African Americans. They were neither Christian nor Muslim. They were unaffiliated. I'd be willing to say that most of them had some degree of religious belief that one could call the object of Christian influence, but in terms of having a formal faith declaration, that tended to be far more rare than we have heretofore thought. I just want to go back to the question that you originally posed, and I was trying to think of a way of answering it. And I think it actually ties in with a couple of things that my colleague David has said. If one started the film off with statements from Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, for example, one would have a view of religion as an enemy of the state, because they argued that many of the freedom and biblical principles as enunciated by churches, from Baptists, from the more informal Baptists to the more formal Anglicans and Presbyterians, these were the sources of supporting establishment practices that suppressed persons who are on the margins of society. So you would have a very, very different view of religion espoused by a very important, articulate, and significant segment of American society. So there's a great deal of dissent and a great deal of disinclination to give a warm embrace to the importance of religion in American civic life. In fact, it's the enemy of freedom, those men would argue.
Let's take this idea of enemy to freedom and go to the Catholic circumstance at the end of the video. There's this whole question, if I may, evangelicalism is set up here as the American religion, as in part because, according to these filmmakers, it represents the democratic republic, right? It's a story of exact coherence between the democratic values of the American we've read this story, right? We know it. So they have opted for this narrative of American religion as coherent with American democracy. And so Catholics are brought in as this dualism, in this kind of dualism, of the people who do not represent that kind of democracy. And so this is the story of Americanization. It's rehearsing a story that was told in the 70s and 80s about what makes a good American, what makes a good religion is democracy. I'm wondering if this isn't a negative story into which Muslims are getting swept into today. Instead of the Pope, you have Sharia. You have a contrary law to American law that is evangelical law. I wonder if you want to make some comments about that and why, if you agree with me, why this story is so enduring that evangelical Protestantism is not only the American religion, it is the American way to which others must be converted as a political matter.
It's the established religion. It's the norm. It's the normative standard by which all other faith declarations are judged, either whether they're consistent with it or whether they diverge significantly from it, or if they even have the potential to become like it. And that's what's dangerous, because it also represents a misreading of our religious past. As I said earlier, there were a number of groups, influential groups, significant groups, that have shaped not only the civic culture but the religious culture as well, who were at the margins. Except for except for an occasional mention of the Quakers, you would have very little idea that Quakers, albeit a small sect, restricted to particular parts of the country, have had an enormous influence in shaping the nation religiously and civically. One loses that kind of complexity in terms of not only the true origins of the country, but also the way in which you do violence to the actual narrative by trying to establish this kind of normative standard that in essence argues that there is an established church. It's the evangelical church, whether it's of a Protestant variation or a Baptist variation or some other variation, it's nonetheless an established church. And that's a misreading of the history, aside from having some rather perhaps some unsavory ramifications when applied to contemporary circumstances.
And even if you avoid the word church, it's certainly the established way of being religious in America, it seems to me. It seems that's what this film is setting out. And again, we don't know what the other episodes are going to be, but this period is so formative, it seems to me. Marty, you teach at Belmont. When you teach this to your students, how do you teach them? How do you teach the Baptists and the Methodists what it is, what religion is? What is the approved religion? Or how do you open the narrative of American religion to something besides evangelical religion?
Well, I think one of the things you have to do is you have to be very diligent not to buy into that story and paint broad stroke, and to look at the overall situation. One of the things that's been interesting for me over the years at Belmont is, and I was talking to you about this earlier, we have no one who has a specialty in world religions, and it kind of bounced around, and so I wanted to do something with that. So a part of our general education curriculum is a course called Spirituality and World Religions, and one of the things that I try to do is not only to introduce students to the world religions, we go to places of worship. So this semester we'll be visiting Hindu temple, Buddhist temple, synagogue, and a mosque. For most students, it's the first time to have ever set foot. And I think it's important that I not bring speakers to the classroom, but that we go there. And if I can be somewhat anecdotal, the first semester I did this was the fall of 2001. And I had students who literally did not want to go to the mosque. They were afraid. And I said, it'll be okay. And a wonderful thing happened after the imam spoke to our group. He said, oh, please stay. We have prepared food for you. And for these students to experience hospitality in a mosque in a personal way, I think a part of education is not simply about the academic part of it, but hopefully, particularly in general education settings, to introduce people to opportunities to have their minds changed.
So if you had the directors of this program here in a post 9/11 world, what would you say to them about this particular segment that that possibly missed an opportunity to encourage tolerance? How can we encourage tolerance through media like this? What were the missed opportunities? In Marty's words, to invite people into another space in a safe way to feel comfortable. What spaces here? Dennis, you want to start?
It would have been interesting if the first scene in the film would have been perhaps a Jewish synagogue in Philadelphia in the 18th century.
Yeah.
I mean, to make the point that we start off at the point of religious diversity and complexity.
In Rhode Island, that synagogue in Rhode Island, yeah. David, what would you have done in a post 9/11 world to this video to make it more helpful?
Well, I talked to these panelists. I've learned a lot from listening to the fellow panelists, but I would certainly include greater discussion of the different faiths. What she was talking about the presence of Islam among people of that time. I don't remember it being mentioned at all. So just basically the same thing he said, that Dennis said, that if we had greater mention of all of these different religious faiths, that you would have a situation of a greater sense of the religious pluralism that we had back at that time.
Sabina?
Maybe some context within world history, and why, how were these founding fathers, not just that there were Muslims among the slave population, but among the Spanish explorers when they came, and going back to their history. You're a little bit of the European history. I think if you don't know some of the European history, you don't understand everything that goes on in this 1 hour of the film. And if you've had European history, you know it. I can see how somebody without any historical background would be a little bit confused or not understand totally maybe the fear of the Catholic Church among the Protestants, maybe a little background.
Marty, I think you've answered this in part. Is there anything you'd like to add to this? What would you say to the directors?
Well, one of the things I was thinking about is one disadvantage that we all have, if I understand this, none of us have seen the whole thing. Mm-hmm. Some of us got a chance to watch a little bit of it. I think I watched about 3 hours last night. I do think one thing that's important in this segment is it is important to understand how we got that Protestant ethos. I don't want to be heard as defending that. Mm-hmm. I simply I think it's very important. This segment, more than any other part that I watched last evening, really kind of showed that and the deep hold that it has. So I think it's important for people who are not a part of that ethos to kind of see what's there. Having my earliest roots in the rural South, revivalism is an enormous. I mean, as a child, we lived from revival to revival, and it's kind of an important thing to see how that develops, I think, in some ways.
Yes, and they do a good job on that. Let me now turn it to you for the last 15 minutes of the program. Did questions arise for you that you would like to address to the panelists?
I have a question. One of the things I would have liked to have seen fleshed out a little bit more, and David, maybe you're the right person to talk about this. In the debate between Jefferson and Henry, those that fell on the Henry side, what exactly were they afraid of would happen if we open this up to the religious marketplace? Were they concerned for men's souls? Were they concerned that we would lack some sort of unifying thread with a state religion? or was it as Professor Lyerly said, that if we didn't have religion, then, or if people were free to choose, they would choose no religion at all, and would that lead to lawlessness, or was that their concern? What exactly were they afraid of?
Well, I think part of it was that it went against the established order, that the Anglican Church was so powerful at the time. So Jefferson's ideas were considered somewhat revolutionary at the time. And so if you, anytime someone has power, it's very few people that are willing to release that power, because there's always a fear. There's a fear of chaos. There's an inherent dichotomy in America between, I think, there's a disconnect between the ideal and the real. And the ideal has always been, at least at times, obviously the ideal was never fully maximized. We didn't get the 14th Amendment until 1868, or the 19th Amendment until 1919 or 1920. But I think that anytime you have those in power, they're often reluctant to adopt something that will take them to a place that they themselves are not familiar with, and it's that unfamiliarity that I think was part of the issue.
I think the other dimension is, of course, Patrick Henry's statute was to provide a tax to support teachers. And I think they could not imagine a world where morality was not taught in the schools. And they had never experienced a world of competing moralities. That democracy itself required a coherent morality, because you had the incoherence of votes. You required people trained to vote. You needed education for those citizens. That kind of power given to propertied white men, free white men, required an educated voter. Oh, that we had an educated voter. But that's what they wanted. And that was what happened through the church. And you can see this dimension carrying forward to the importance of schools in this Catholic-Protestant debate. And you can see it even carrying forward in the 20th century, where so many of the church-state cases have to do with subsidizing schools, parochial schools still, whether it's transportation or school books to segregated schools in the South, or prayer in schools, or how do you teach religion. So schools were always an issue, and that's where it began in Virginia.
I think it's difficult for us to see how obsessed the Founding Fathers were with a virtuous citizenry. I think, it was a very scary proposition, and you witness this tension between liberty as a value on one hand and authority, and how do you put that together? And I'm jumping a little bit ahead of Patrick Henry and all of that, but as folks in this country watched what was happening with our allies in France in their revolution, folks got scared. Where will this thing go? And now backing up a little bit, we saw that Jefferson, is presented as not having anything theologically in common with Baptists, but I'll support your right to say that. But there's an interesting kind of thing with Benjamin Franklin's friendship with the evangelist George Whitefield. Franklin couldn't accept what he was saying, but boy, it's good that he's saying it, because ordinary folks need something that they can, follow, and so they'll be good folks, and we can build a society around it.
Other issues that have come up for you in the course of watching this?
Sure, I've got one. I think David was right to point to Madison, and Madison's overriding concern in the Federalist Papers at most points seems to be the danger of factions. We can't put this whole polity together if people are going to go off their different ways. Yeah. And therefore, the most important thing about religious freedom isn't that it's good for religion, but that it's good for, it makes politics or it makes a civil polity possible. I wonder whether that sense of religion as a danger is something that you resonate with, as well as religion as the substance of virtue. Not just David, but the whole panel. But I appreciate David for bringing it up.
Me.
Is there a legitimate basis for concern about religion? Here it's presented as an unmitigated good.
Yeah.
Right.
It's. I'm still thinking about your comment, because I really think it goes to the heart of the problem. The use of the schools for training the virtuous citizenry, and sometimes through the agency of the church, is a fallback position in terms of establishing virtue. Because virtue traditionally, at least in the way in which the British talked about it and the way it was inherited by the founding fathers, virtue was correlated with property owning. That's what made you virtuous. If you have a stake in the polity, then of course you're going to do the right thing. Well, what happens when you have a citizenry, a mass citizenry, that's propertyless? You have to use other agencies, other structures to establish virtue. That's why schools become important. That's why churches become important. And so you're absolutely right, Jim, that there is the relationship between the use of the church to establish civic objectives over against trying to tame people in terms of their moral sensibilities and their theological loyalties.
On the other hand, you have the perfectionists like Charles Finney, who say there is a higher law at work in the nation than the Constitution, who are. It was interesting to me that they entitled this a New Eden as opposed to a New Zion. It would have radically changed their point of view, I think, if they'd recognized this was not a New Eden, it was a New Zion. That those who came here seeking freedom, they came for the freedom to be righteous, not the freedom to be unrighteous, right? And so that struck me as dramatic. And it's that perfectionism that breaks up the dualism between evangelicalism and rationalism. You've got this, and I don't know whether it's whistling in the dark and a kind of denial that exists in America, even though it's all around us and competes with government. That kind of perfectionist thinking that Finney represented, that Quakers represented, certainly Latter-day Saints represented, that says we will be good citizens insofar as your laws are moral. And that was true, of course, with the Fugitive Slave Act, where evangelical religion also said we will disobey this law. And so you see, it seems to me that the only institution that can marshal against the government with equal force, as the government holds, is religion itself. And so religion must be subordinated to the state at some level, and that notion of subordination never comes up with these early founders or with these early religionists.
Good point. The IRS doesn't come after Bishop Hughes. You know, I was thinking about the issue.
Yes, the whole denial. I assume a modern audience would raise their eyebrows at Hughes telling his parishioners how to vote. Or they may notice that the argument before the New York School Board was not that there was no question of subsidizing religious activity. It's whether that religious activity would be fairly conducted in the schools.
So when was that, when did that become law?
When did
that
what?
Separation from the pulpit, you cannot endorse candidates.
You still can do it, you just can't do it and maintain your tax exemption. So you don't get the benefit from the state if you're going.
Of the IRS.
But doesn't that go back, I may be mistaken, doesn't that go back to the Johnson administration? I don't think that's an ancient thing.
Well, the
IRS
taxes aren't an ancient thing either. So,
right.
So they develop it. At first, they want to exempt churches as charities. When churches cease to act as charities under the definition of the IRS, then they lose their tax-exempt status. They're free to say whatever they want. They're just not free to be treated as charitable institutions when they do that.
I think the regulation had some roots in anti-Catholicism in the 1920s. When there was an attempt to sort of separate them out and prevent that reoccurrence of the Hughes phenomenon in a way, particularly with the rise of Smith and other kind of candidates. But I think you're right. I think it was more the Johnson. I think the technical regulation that applies today was probably much more of a modern phenomenon, but I think it has its roots in the 20s.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for your participation tonight. Gene, do you want to say anything else before we?
No, if I just one thing.
Please,
I was
please.
championing at the bit. I think two things that bother me are this distinction of the elites and the role and the threat that religion posed, and I would have loved to have seen more on the founders settling that out, because clearly with the Electoral College, the makeup of the Senate, they were concerned about preserving a certain guidance until the citizenry was virtuous enough, if you will, or some future date. That bothered me. And then I also was just curious, because there's some thought that, the sort of part of that early root of religious liberty was, in effect, I'm not going to kill you, I'm going to let you survive until I have a chance to convert you to my way of thinking, which is a long way from free thinking or acceptance of your right to and I think there was a strain of that in all of this development. When you talk about the founders, sort of a Roger Williams idea, I guess, sort of, we just, remember they came out of an era where I disagree with you, I'm going to kill you and remove your stain from our society. So again, maybe the first hour plumbs this a little more, but we do look at the founders awfully virtuous here, and I think they were very much pragmatists. They met in bars for a reason, as opposed to churches. And so I think there was a sort of failing here of a practical acknowledgement too, which various of you have touched on.
To make a distinction between toleration and liberty.
And liberty, and that seems almost
that was eluded in this, totally
because
lost.
you seem to go all the way to one side, and again,
yes,
virtuous as they may have been, the founders, they were also very pragmatic politicians with a lot to gain and property interest, to protect.
Well, appropriately, the last words go to the Freedom Forum. So, thank you very much.
Good to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Marty?